You were never meant to hear this because the Maddox heirs were paid not just to keep quiet, but to erase the memory of what lived in the soil they sold. And when I tell you this, you will feel the pull of something old, something that does not want its story spoken out loud yet. Here we are standing at the edge of a property line, marked not by fences, but by silence and blood. The Maddox family took their money and vanished. But the land remained patient, waiting as it always had, because boundaries are not lines on maps. They are prisons carved into the earth by those who understood that what was buried here could not be allowed to roam free. The first time you step onto the property, it feels wrong in a way you cannot explain. The trees bend as if they are leaning to listen. The ground seems soft, even when dry, and the air has that weighted hush that makes every breath heavy. And then you remember the strange clause in the deed, the one written in archaic language, warning that no foundation may be dug deeper than 4 feet, that no stone may be overturned past the root line, that no structure may disturb the boundary wall of broken rock, laid by hands whose names are no longer remembered. This is not superstition. This is not folklore. This is contract law forged in fear. And when you stand at the threshold, you understand why families, like the Maddox heirs, learned long ago to take their payment and never return, because they had once lived through what happens when the ground is broken and the voices are stirred awake. You think of the 12 children of the Riley line, buried without markers. You think of the rumors of unregistered births and names scrubbed from church records. You think of how men in suits came with envelopes of cash, telling the heirs to forget. And you realize this was not charity. This was containment. The land was never meant to be owned. It was meant to be guarded. So I ask you now to step with me into the forbidden. Because once you hear what was found beneath those stones, you will never again believe that history is written in ink. History is written in fear and sealed in silence. And tonight, I will show you why. The Maddox heirs were not fools. They were survivors. They inherited more than land they inherited. A warning passed through whispers at dinner tables and sealed in wills that spoke of shadows older than the family name itself. Their fortune was not built on commerce, not on sweat, not on toil, but on an agreement forged in secrecy with forces no preacher dared name and no court dared acknowledge. The land was not theirs to give. It was theirs to endure. And when their turn came, they sold their silence like every generation before them. You must understand that silence is currency in the world of forbidden history. Those who can keep secrets are rewarded, while those who break them are erased. The Maddox family chose wealth over memory, but wealth runs thin. Memory, however, festers beneath the skin of the earth, waiting to be rediscovered by men like me, who believe ownership is power, but ownership of cursed ground is never power. It is surrender. The first sign came not in screams, but in dreams. The kind of dreams that do not fade when you wake. Dreams where you are walking hallways, too narrow for your shoulders. Dreams where you hear children counting, but the numbers stop short at 11 dreams, where a woman whispers that one was never buried, only bound. Those dreams are not imagination. They are inheritance, and the moment you step into this chain of possession, you become heir to the same debt. Think about this. The deeds were drafted in duplicate, one for the county office, one for the church archive. Yet the church copy is gone since the fire of 1921, while the county records are curiously intact. That is not coincidence. That is eradication. Someone wanted the covenant removed from the hands of faith and left only the legal structure, as if men of law could control what men of prayer could not tell me. Does that sound like chance or design? And so, when I bought the property, when I placed my name where the Maddox signature once stood, I was not simply becoming an owner. I was becoming a link in a chain, forged generations deep. A chain built not to protect the land, but to contain what the land itself hides. And as the ink dried on my contract, I swear to you, I felt the soil shift, as if the earth itself was acknowledging a new warden. The Maddox heirs smiled when they handed me the keys, but their eyes told a different story. They were not celebrating a sale. They were celebrating their release, as if a burden had been lifted from their shoulders and placed on mine. Their laughter was brittle, like glass about to crack. Their hands trembled not from age, but from relief, because now I was the one who had signed away my ignorance. Now I was the one bound to keep quiet or pay the price. The house itself stood like a sentinel at the edge of the property, all narrow windows, staring like watchful eyes. The wood warped with time, yet unnervingly alive. When the wind pressed against its frame, it did not creak like timber, it sighed like lungs. The walls held more than nails. They held memories pressed into the grain by generations who dared not speak aloud what they endured. The rooms smelled of dust and salt, as though the ocean had once drowned them, though the nearest coast lay hundreds of miles away. On the first night, I wandered the halls counting doors. They did not add up. The floor plan I held showed 6, yet I found 7. And when I returned with a lantern, the 7th had vanished, as though the house itself was testing my conviction, bending perception to remind me that my purchase was not of brick or wood, but of something far older. The architecture was not built, it was conjured. I opened a drawer in the master bedroom, and inside was a folded letter yellowed with time, the handwriting sharp, precise. It carried no name, only a phrase repeated 3 times, as though repetition bound it to the page. We do not pay in coin. We do not pay in blood. We do not pay in coin. We do not pay in blood. We do not pay in coin. We do not pay in blood. The words was a symbol carved so deeply into the paper that it tore through, leaving a hole like an eye, staring back at me. From that moment, I knew I had not bought land. I had bought silence, and silence is never empty. It is always filled with the echoes of what it hides. The Maddox heirs had been paid to forget, and now their debt was mine. The origin of the Maddox curse was never written in books, never whispered in church, never spoken in town halls, because it did not belong to history. It belonged to the space between history and nightmare, a place where truth becomes unbearable and survival demands silence. It began long before the house was raised, before the land was parceled and sold. The soil itself carried weight, like a graveyard without stones, a burial ground for packs, not bodies. The first Maddox settlers were not farmers. They were seekers. Men who carried maps with no towns marked on them, maps that pointed only to places where the earth was said to breathe. They did not come to cultivate, they came to feed. The journals I found in the locked trunk beneath the staircase were written in iron gall ink, the script uneven, as if the writer's hand shook not from age, but from what they were forced to record. The entries spoke of meetings held at midnight circles, drawn not with chalk, but with salt and bone blood spilled, not as sacrifice, but as contract. They claimed the land gave back more than it took, harvests in years, when others starved protection in storms that flattened neighboring towns, wealth in forms untraceable, yet undeniable, and all of it demanded one thing, silence. But silence is never enough. When power is involved, it demands heirs, it demands continuity. So the Maddox line was bound to secrecy, not by choice, but by blood. Every child born into the family was marked before speech, their mouths pressed with ash, Their names whispered, not in joy, but in warning. You belong to the land, and the land belongs to you. One entry in the journal was darker than the rest, a confession written in trembling script. It read, "We did not give them what they asked, and they came for the twins. They came with hands of smoke and voices that rattled the rafters. The matriarch told us never to speak of it, but the screams are still in the walls. The screams are in the ground, and the screams will return for anyone who dares to look too deep." As I finished reading the words, the lantern flickered, though there was no wind, and I heard the faintest sound, not from outside, but from beneath the floorboards. A sound too soft to be footsteps, too steady to be coincidence, like something pacing in the dark, waiting for recognition, waiting for me. The first time the house revealed itself, it was not with a scream or a shadow, but with a sound too human to be explained and too ancient to be denied. It came from beneath the parlor floor, as if the house itself exhaled, after holding its breath for centuries. I knelt and pressed my ear to the wood. The boards were cold, not with winter chill, but with something older, a chill that seeped into the bone like recognition. The pacing I had heard before grew louder, deliberate, like a rhythm meant to be heard. The boards shivered under my palm, as if something below them was alive and restless. In the cellar, the air was heavy with dust, yet the floor showed no dust at all. It was swept clean, as though someone had been down there recently, though no one had lived in the house for decades. The stone walls dripped with moisture, but not the moisture of rain. It smelled metallic, coppery, and it carried with it a faint hum like iron, singing a dirge deep in the ground. Against the far wall was a door smaller than a man could pass through, built not of stone or wood, but of iron, blackened and warped as if it had been through fire. The lock was missing, yet the door did not move when I pulled. Instead, it groaned low like an animal, warning me away. Etched into the iron was a symbol I recognized from the journal. The circle, the bones, the bloodlines carved so deeply, they seemed to bleed rust. The same mark pressed on every Maddox heir, before they could even speak. When I stepped back, the cellar seemed to lean closer, as though the house itself wanted me to open the door. But I did not. The journal had warned that silence was not safety, it was survival, and opening the sealed places was not discovery, it was invitation. Still, the hum in the walls did not stop. It followed me up the stairs. It crept into the parlor. It moved with me, like an unseen shadow. And for the first time, I realized this was not a house holding memories. This was a house holding prisoners, and the Maddox family had been the wardens of something they could neither control nor destroy, only contain. And now, the land had passed to me, the heir, by purchase, not by blood, and the silence was breaking. The payment the Maddox heirs received was not inheritance. It was a bribe dressed as legacy. When they left this land, they left behind not just soil, but a burden, a pact forged long before their names were etched into deeds and contracts. I traced the records in the courthouse pages. Yellowed ink, fading, yet the signatures carried weight as though the paper itself resisted erasure. Each sale, each transfer was accompanied by a second document sealed, not with ink, but with wax dark as dried blood. The wording was vague, but the promise was clear: silence in exchange for survival. The heirs were not selling property. They were selling amnesia. They were paid not to remember, not to speak of what lay buried beneath the roots of their house, beneath the iron door. They were paid to forget their own history, to abandon names of the children who vanished, to erase nights when the town heard cries from the hills, and to pretend that the Maddox estate was only cursed by poverty, not by hunger, not by ritual, not by a pact sealed before their birth. When I looked deeper, The names of banks and companies that handled the payments were not local. They were institutions tied to railroads, tied to war, contracts, tied to the very engines that reshaped the nation. Money moved in silence, while the Maddox heirs faded into anonymity, their story scrubbed clean by ledgers that spoke of debts forgiven in exchange for silence, debts that no court could ever explain. And here I was, standing in the house holding the journal, hearing the hum behind the walls, and realizing that the silence had an expiration date. The heirs could forget, but the land could not. The payment was not for erasure, it was for delay. As I stood in the parlor, the iron door below shifted. I felt it not with ears, but with bones. The vibration rising through the beams into my chest, a pulse, steady like a heart, that had been waiting a long time, and for a moment. I understood the truth. The heirs had not been paid to forget. They had been paid to stall, to keep the secret contained until the land changed hands. And now it was mine, and the silence demanded to be broken. The children were the shadows that the Maddox family refused to name. Their existence was whispered, but never written, faces without portraits, voices without echoes. The journals that survived mentioned them only as offerings, not as sons or daughters, and that single word carries more weight than any confession. One entry described how the twins were chosen, not born chosen, like cattle, set apart at birth and raised in silence. Their footsteps muffled their laughter. Forbidden, they were not permitted to play outside the walls because the land itself was hungry, and the family knew that one day the land would take what it was promised. The neighbors recalled odd details children glimpsed at windows, yet never seen in school children whose eyes glowed pale in candlelight. Children who would stand at the edge of the orchard, staring outward as though they could see something that no adult dared to face. And then, as quickly as they appeared, they were gone, replaced by new whispers, new names that no one remembered. After winter, the payments to the heirs began only after the final pair vanished. The last twins, the matriarch ordered. Silence. With those words we do not speak of. The twins and the town obeyed, because the town was complicit, because hunger was not the burden of one family. It was a debt shared by every hand that benefited from the estate, from the land, from the crops that grew unnaturally fast. When watered near the stone foundation, I realized the heirs were not cursed. They were carriers, custodians of a covenant made in shadow. The twins were never lost. They were delivered, and the silence that followed was not grief. It was compliance. Standing above the iron door, I felt their presence. It was not imagination. It was not fear. It was memory, and it did not belong to me yet. It lived in my bones. The silence of generations pressing against me, reminding me that the heirs were not paid to Eska. They were paid to hand the debt forward to me, to you, to anyone who would inherit the soil. The children are still here, not in body but in binding. The walls whisper their names, though the town has forgotten. And if the iron door opens, they will not come out as children. They will return as the hunger they were trained to become. The night I returned to the property, the air was unnaturally still, a wind in the trees, no animal sounds, only the heavy weight of silence that felt like it was pressing down on my chest. The kind of silence that does not wait but watches. I carried a lantern, its weak glow barely touching the edges of the path that wound toward the cellar, where the iron door sat buried in the earth, like a wound that never healed. The closer I came, the more wrong the ground felt. The soil shifted underfoot, like it was breathing. The air grew damp, heavy, as though the earth itself exhaled. Each time I took a step, the cellar entrance loomed before me, black stone walls jutting from the earth, the door bound with chains, rusted but not broken, the lock old yet strong, a lock meant not to keep intruders out, but to keep something in. I placed my hand against the metal, and it was warm, not from the sun, not from fire, but from something pulsing beneath it, the warmth of flesh, though no flesh should exist beneath stone. The lantern flickered, as if reacting to the heat. Shadows stretched across the ground, twisting into forms that resembled children. Thin, long-limbed yet distorted faces half-formed, their eyes hollow, yet alive. The townspeople had known all along. This was not simply about wealth or silence. It was about containment. The Maddox heirs were not paid to forget. They were paid to never open this door, to keep the covenant sealed by ignorance and greed. But now, with the door beneath my hand, I felt the weight of centuries, the hunger pressing upward, desperate to taste the world again. The chains rattled without wind. The lock groaned as if it resented its own purpose, and in that moment, I realized the family never chose silence out of fear. They chose it out of loyalty, loyalty to something older than themselves, loyalty to the hunger that gave them their prosperity. The twins were not victims. They were vessels, and the door was not a barrier. It was a mouth. When the first chain snapped, it did not sound like metal breaking. It sounded like bone splintering, and the air rushed forward, hot and rancid like breath after endless sleep. The lantern nearly extinguished. The shadows merged, and for the first time, I understood what the matriarch meant when she said, "We do not speak of the twins." The air after the first chain broke was different. It was no longer silence. It was expectation, the kind of pause that comes before a scream. The lantern sputtered. Shadows curled along the walls, and the door seemed to pulse like a vein. The ground beneath me trembled faintly, and I knew with absolute certainty that the land itself was alive. It had been waiting. In the Maddox records, I found later there were fragments of ritual notes written in a hand that shook but still obeyed instructions. They spoke of offerings made on nights when the stars shifted into unfamiliar positions. They spoke of children brought here, not for burial, but for feeding. The family Belth was not built on land, deals, or clever trades. It was built on obedience. They obeyed something buried in this earth, something older than scripture, older than history. The matriarch's warning echoed inside me like a curse. We do not speak of the twins, not because they were lost, but because they were never allowed to be lost. They were bound to this place, bound as conduits, bound as keys, the children adopted by the family, the heirs that vanished one by one. They were not taken by tragedy. They were taken by design, chosen, raised, and eventually given back to the hunger below. And as the second chain split, its sound was louder, sharper, like the tearing of flesh. The lantern swayed, and in its brief flashes I saw faces pressed against the iron door. Stretched eyes wide, mouths frozen in silent cries, and yet they were not faces of the dead. They were faces still alive, trapped, yearning, desperate for release. Each one a Maddox child, each one a sacrifice waiting for the ritual to complete. I understood now why the heirs sold the property. They did not want the money. They wanted distance. They wanted strangers to inherit the curse, because the family could not carry it anymore. But curses do not vanish. They wait. They cling. They sink into blood and soil and wood until another hand, another fool, another voice is drawn into the whisper of chains. The door breathed. The lock strained, and my hand would not release the lantern. Though I begged it to drop, I begged my legs to run. But they were not mine anymore. My body was no longer servant to me. It was servant to the ritual, and the hunger below was patient, no longer. The third chain did not break. It snapped like a bone, and when it did, The lantern light surged unnaturally bright, as though the flame had been given fuel, not of oil, but of breath. The air rushed inward toward the iron door, as if the room itself inhaled, and in that pull I felt myself swaying, closer, pulled into its gravity. I tried to resist, but resistance was already a memory. My mind clawed at reasons to escape, while my body leaned forward against my own will. And that was when I saw it etched along the stone around the door symbols. Older than language marks, burned into the foundation long before the Maddox family built their house above them. These were not decorations. They were instructions carved as bargains, commands or prayers. The forgotten documents hinted at this ritual, but never explained it fully. They used words like continuity and debt. They spoke of the twins not as children, but as vessels. Something had been promised here, something that demanded return. It was not death that the Maddox family feared, it was inheritance, because what they inherited was not land, but servitude to a power that could not die. As the fourth chain fell, I heard them. The voices, dozens layered together, whispering my name, though I had never spoken it aloud in this room. Their sound was inside my skull, not in the air around me. Yet it was undeniable. Maddox blood had weakened its hold. Maddox heirs had tried to abandon it, but the bargain was not with them alone. The bargain was with anyone who touched this property, anyone who set foot where the symbols breathed. The iron bent inward with a groan, and the gap revealed not darkness but movement, a trembling fluid blacker than shadow, shifting like muscle under skin. It was alive, and it wanted me. Its hunger was not for food, but for use to make me what the heirs refused to become, to crown me with the curse as heir by possession, not by blood. In that moment, I realized the Maddox heirs were not paid to forget. They were paid to surrender their inheritance and let the burden fall to someone else, someone like me, someone foolish enough to dig where silence should have reigned. The final chain quivered, and I knew when it gave way, the ritual would not end. It would begin again through me. The last chain did not shatter in violence. It dissolved as though time itself had grown tired of holding it together. The sound was not metal breaking, but a sigh, a release, centuries in the making. And the iron door leaned forward, not as a barrier, removed, but as a mouth opening for breath. Behind it the movement swelled into form. No body, no face, just a mass of shifting matter, blacker than midnight, and yet glowing at its edges with a sick pale fire. It pulsed with rhythm like a heart, though not human. A heart that had kept beating long before the Maddox name ever existed, and in that pulse, I felt my own chest answer, as if it commanded the rhythm of my blood. I wanted to look away, but the pull was unbearable. It was not just light, it was memory flooding in, memories that were not mine yet, stitched into me fragments of other men, other heirs, other owners who had stood in this chamber before me. Their faces twisted, their voices, chanting words I did not understand. But the meaning was clear. None of them left this room the same. Then the truth came like a blade across thought. The Maddox heirs had not been paid to forget. They had been paid to endure silence, to bury what they had witnessed, and carry on as if nothing had happened, because the entity behind the iron door does not kill it, binds it, latches itself into a family line or a land deed. It weaves into contracts and bloodlines alike. The Maddox heirs were not escaping. They were renting time, buying delay with money, with flesh, with memory. And when the money ran out, the burden leapt to the next fool who opened the door. The whispers grew louder, not just my name now, but promises. Promises of power, wealth, dominion over others, the kind of words that ignite hunger in men who already think they are strong. But underneath the promises was another sound, quieter, deeper, The sound of weeping, of children crying in endless echo, a chorus of sorrow. The tea fed the thing just as much as any oath. The entity was not offering, it was demanding. And as I stood there, I understood the heirs had chosen silence, not because they were cowards, but because silence was the only way to keep the world from hearing this voice once heard. It could not be forgotten. Once touched, it could not be refused. The Maddox family had been shackled by inheritance, but I had shackled myself by choice, by curiosity. And now the door was no longer a door. It was a mirror showing me what I was about to become. The air in the chamber thickened, and with every breath I drew, it was as if I was inhaling centuries of dust. Grief and oaths broken. The entity swelled larger, but it was not growing in size. It was growing in me, pressing its way into thought, memory, and marrow, until I could not separate where I ended, and it began. It showed me its first arrival, not in words, but in vision. A night long before the Maddox name, long before deeds and contracts, long before fences and titles. When the land itself was still raw, still unclaimed by paper and ink. The sky was split open, and something fell, not from heaven, but from a wound in time itself, a fracture pouring out, matter that was alive, yet not of this earth. It sank into the soil, it hid in stone, and when men finally came with axes and claims, they disturbed it, and thought they had merely found iron veins. But what they found was older than any earth metal. It was essence. It was hunger waiting for flesh to arrive. The first Maddox was not a farmer. He was not a builder. He was a vessel. He carved the land into property, not to own, but to contain, because he realized what his hands had unearthed was not resource, but ruin. And if he did not chain it here, it would seep outward through rivers, mountains, villages, until the whole valley sang with its whisper. The heirs who followed did not inherit wealth. They inherited the lock, each generation forced to play the role of warden, keeping contracts, signing silence, enforcing rituals hidden beneath the facade of business deals and estate transfers, and those who refused, those who tried to run from it, were dragged back not by law, but by dream, waking in the night, at the edge of this chamber, pulled here like moths to black fire, and now it had me. I was not a Maddox yet. I was here. I was chosen not by blood, but by will, by the simple act of stepping across a line and accepting the deed, not knowing it was never land I had. Purchased but a covenant, a chain, a vow written, not in ink, but in shadow. The entity pulsed, and in that pulse, I saw the truth. The Maddox heirs had not been protecting the world from it. They had been protecting it from the world, feeding it slowly, managing the hunger, disguising the cost in ledgers and silence, so that no one would know what lay beneath. But now the system was broken. Their silence had cracked, and through me the secret would bleed. The chamber no longer felt like stone. It felt like the inside of a skull. And I was the thought, rattling inside it. Every echo was my own voice, but twisted deeper, heavier, as if another version of me was already speaking the words I had not yet dared to say. The entity leaned close, not with form, but with pressure, a weight against the chest. The kind of weight that made men kneel without realizing their knees had bent. It whispered in silence, not in sound, but in knowing, and what it showed me was not threat, but promise. A promise sharp enough to cut the soul. It revealed that every Maddox heir had been offered the same bargain, and every one had failed. Not because they lacked will, but because they lacked vision. They tried to contain it. They tried to fight the current, instead of letting it carry them to the ocean, beyond sight and beyond men. And so they had become jailers, slaves to a hunger They were too frightened to embrace. But I was not Maddox. I was not heir to their fears. I had walked here with no chains on my name, and so it told me that I could do what they never dared. I could stop being warden and become vessel, not jailer, but master, because power was not given, power was taken, and here before me lay a river that had drowned generations, waiting for a man who would not fear the water. The walls bent like heat. The chamber curved as though reality itself was bowing, and I felt it slip into me not with violence, but with familiarity, like something that had always been mine and was only now returning it pressed into my blood, into my thought, into my marrow, until my skin felt too thin to hold what surged beneath it, and in that moment I understood the curse was never in the land, it was in the silence, the refusal of those before me to speak the truth aloud, to claim it and shape it. Instead, they had hidden it under contracts and whispers, hoping no one would look too close, but the silence was weakness, and weakness breeds ruin. Now the choice lay in me: take the vow and feed it, as the Maddox Heirs did, or take the hunger itself and wield it as my own. The chamber began to shiver like a living lung drawing breath. The air thickened until it felt like tar sliding through my throat with each inhale, and yet I did not choke. Instead, I grew hungrier, hungrier than any mortal mouth could explain. The hunger was not for food or flesh. It was for surrender, the kind of surrender that reshapes a man into something more. I felt the floor ripple beneath my feet like water. Though it was carved stone, the walls stretched taller than they had been. The ceiling vanished into a horizon that did not belong to earth. I knew then that the entity was no prisoner. It had only been waiting for a mind reckless enough to let it in. It did not beg me. It did not demand it, only showed me images that poured like blood into the back of my eyes. Fields where armies bent their knees, not out of loyalty, but out of compulsion. Cities that silenced their own screams, because one voice had told them to. Monuments rising not to gods, but to men who had stolen godhood and dared to wear it as their own skin. And I saw myself in those visions, not broken, not consumed, but enthroned, crowned in shadow, seated above generations that would not remember my name, yet would carry my will in their bones. I was no longer being tempted. I was being mirrored. The hunger was mine, reflected back 1,000-fold. The land above the Maddox property shook with unseen pulse. The house groaned, as if every beam remembered every air that had tried and failed to hold the silence together. Now cracks formed in more than the walls. Cracks formed in history, in memory, in the boundary that had pretended to keep the living apart from what waits beyond. I should have run, but the word run had been erased from me, the way light vanishes inside a black hole. There was no flight, only fall, and in falling, there was no end, only descent. The deeper I fell, the more I rose inside myself, until the two motions blurred, and I realized I was not becoming vessel. I was becoming threshold. In the silence that followed, a voice not my own filled the chamber, and yet it came from my mouth. We will not be forgotten. The silence that followed was not empty. It was weaponized silence, a silence that had been bought and sold like land and titles, a silence that had sealed the lips of the Maddox heirs for generations. Not because they were too afraid to speak, but because someone had made it profitable for them not to. When I uncovered the old records hidden behind a false panel in the study, I found ledgers thick with signatures, not of family, but of corporations, banks and trusts, names that repeated across the decades, names that moved like phantoms through every war, every depression, every so-called crisis of the nation. These were not coincidences. These were markers left by a hand that had always been there, guiding, erasing, paying. The heirs had not simply been told to forget. They had been trained in forgetting, conditioned to pass down silence as inheritance. The payments disguised as land grants, stocks, and political favors ensured their children would never ask the question of why the property could not be sold outside their bloodline until someone broke the pattern by accident or design. But why was forgetting so valuable? Because memory itself is dangerous. Memory keeps wounds open. Memory keeps the dead restless. Memory reminds the living that they were not always powerless, that there was once a pact older than any government, a pact buried beneath the Maddox estate, one that no court, no church, no institution could risk being unearthed. The names in the ledger tied back to senators, judges, railroad barons, even men who sat in the highest seats of faith, all of them connected by the same ink, the same transactions that bled from the Maddox family vault into the veins of America itself. When the twins were erased from history, when their existence was cut away like a tumor, it was not just for family honor, it was for control. And that control remains layered into every system you trust, every OA, the sworn, every institution that claims to protect you. Their silence is not absence. Their silence is a structure, a scaffolding built from fear and gold. The heirs were not victims. They were accomplices. They held their tongues not because of a curse, but because the curse was profitable. Every generation learned to keep the truth locked away in exchange for wealth and protection, until one generation failed and sold the land to me. Now the silence has cracked, and once it breaks, there is no buying it back. The deeper I dug, the more I realized the Maddox estate was never just land. It was a vault, a reservoir of memory that institutions could not allow to spill open beneath the soil were foundations, not of stone, but of ritual circles. Symbols burned into bedrock long before colonists ever claimed the territory. The property was chosen not for its beauty or its timber, but because it sat on a crossing point where power converged and where those who knew how to harness it could control not just men, but generations. The pact that bound the Maddox heirs was not forged in a courtroom. It was older than constitutions, older than kingdoms. It was struck between blood and shadow, between families that carried certain lines and orders, that thrived in secrecy. These institutions used the estate as an anchor, a tether to keep influence buried, yet accessible whenever they needed to stir unrest, guide politics, or bind men through unseen chains. Every war that erupted, every financial collapse, every surge of industry had a line running back to these hidden circles. The ledgers I found were not mere accounts. They were maps. Blood maps showing how control flowed through time, from forgotten rituals into corporate boardrooms, from whispered oaths beneath candlelight into laws signed beneath national flags. The twins, the ones erased from all records, were not just children. They were conduits, heirs, born not to inherit wealth, but to carry memory, to embody a knowledge that could unravel the illusion. Their existence threatened the pact because they remembered too much, because they could not be made to forget. So the family was silenced, the land locked down, and the institutions fed their heirs. Comfort, to ensure obedience. Forgetting became a trade. Silence became a market, and obedience became the highest currency. And the people around you today, the very institutions you trust, still operate in that same current yo. You think you see leaders, but you see only the outer layer of a pact that stretches deeper than you have ever been allowed to imagine. This is why they paid the heirs to forget. This is why they let the land rot until someone outside the bloodline held the deed, because they believed no outsider would recognize the marks. No outsider would feel the weight of what was buried. They were wrong. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Now you stand at the edge of a truth that men were never meant to face. The Maddox estate was not just cursed ground. It was an initiation waiting in silence for the one who would trespass without chains. And now that one is you, think carefully, because from this point on, you do not return to comfort. You do not return to innocence. You return only to power, but power that scars, power that strips away the illusions and shows the mechanics behind the world. You were raised to obey. The twins, the silence, the payments, the locked doors. It was never about family. It was about control. The kind of control that rewrites memory itself. If they could erase bloodlines, they could erase your history, your heritage, your identity, without you ever realizing you had been hollowed out from the inside. That is the machinery at work around you. It is not in the past. It is active. It is present. It is watching you even as you hear this. And here is where you choose. Remain blind or step through the threshold when men step through. There is no retreat, only becoming, and to become, you must declare yourself to the forces that still hunt the silence. I am going to give you a phrase, not a charm, not a spell, but a mark, a signal that will seal you as one who no longer belongs to the sleep. Type this twice in the comments to lock it into yourself and to show the system you are not theirs anymore. I remember what they tried to erase. Write it once for yourself. Write it twice for the brotherhood of those who refuse the silence. And the system will notice. The algorithm will see the mark, and men like you will find each other drawn together by what cannot be named openly. This is the moment where you shed the mask they gave you. This is the moment where you take back the eyes that were blinded. And if you are afraid, good fear is the door you must walk through. Type it twice now and let them know you are awake. You have reached the last chamber. And nothing about this place is what it first appeared to be. The Maddox heirs were not guardians of a home. They were jailers. Of a memory buried so deep that even they were forced to sell their silence, piece by piece, until it became their inheritance. And now it is yours. The land is not cursed in the way old tales describe. It is cursed because it remembers, and memory is the one thing the system cannot allow. The walls remember the cries. The ground remembers the betrayal. The house itself remembers the bargains, sealed in whispers and ink. And when you stepped onto that property, you woke the memory from its sleep. It moved from the soil into you, and now it will not let you go. This was never about you buying land. This was the land choosing you, because you carry something. Most men do not. The willingness to look at the forbidden without looking away. That is why the story reached you. That is why you could not stop listening. That is why the silence broke in your presence. And now you know what they were paid to forget. The twins were only a fragment. The deeper truth is that entire families were erased, entire bloodlines erased, until history became a theater staged for the blind. They were not preserving property. They were erasing witnesses, and the erasure continues today, through institutions that you still trust without question. But you are no longer the same man. You crossed a line that cannot be uncrossed. You know the mechanics of forgetting. You know the price of silence. You know that the past was not buried. It was hidden, waiting for one voice to drag it back into the light. Carry this with you, not as a tale but as a weapon, because the moment you see the truth behind the veil, you are marked by it. It will call to you again through stories, through places, through sudden shivers in the night, and each time you will know. It is not fear. It is recognition. The Maddox heirs were chained to forgetting. You are chained to remembering, and remembering is far more dangerous. Welcome to the burden. Welcome to the brotherhood. Welcome to the shadow.